My name is Vincent Ramirez. I'm a cabinet maker from Phoenix, Arizona, and 72 hours ago the dead started walking. When the zombie outbreak hit, I was installing kitchen cabinets in a quiet suburb. I watched my neighbors turn into monsters, made impossible choices about who lives and dies, and discovered that building furniture prepared me for building survival shelters better than any military training ever could. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comments section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. Friday, October 13th, 2023, 7:47 in the evening. I remember the exact time because I was checking my phone to calculate overtime pay when Mrs. Henderson started screaming from the living room. I'm Vincent Ramirez, and what I'm about to tell you happened during the first 72 hours of what the media would later call the zombie outbreak. But they never called it that in the beginning. In the beginning, they didn't call it anything at all. I was finishing up a custom kitchen cabinet installation in North Scottsdale, one of those quiet suburban neighborhoods where the biggest excitement was usually someone's sprinkler system flooding their driveway. The kind of place where people paid good money for handcrafted cabinets with soft close hinges and dovetail joints. Mrs. Henderson had been my client for 3 weeks, and I was putting the final touches on her dream kitchen. White oak cabinets with a natural finish, brushed nickel hardware, and precision that would make my grandfather proud. You know, I always told my customers that good craftsmanship meant planning for 3 things: what you can see, what you can't see, and what you pray never happens. That Friday, all 3 came into play. The cabinets looked perfect from the outside, the hidden joinery was solid as a rock, and the worst-case scenario I'd over-engineered for was about to save our lives. I'd been working since noon, measuring twice and cutting once like my grandfather taught me. Every screw placement was precise, every joint was perfect, and every measurement was double-checked. My supervisor always called me obsessive about details. But obsessive is what separates furniture that lasts 50 years from furniture that falls apart in 5. I had no idea that obsessive was also what would keep us breathing through the next 3 days. Mrs. Henderson was 68 years old, a retired school teacher who'd spent her savings on this kitchen renovation after her husband passed last year. She'd been bringing me sweet tea every few hours and asking about my work, genuinely interested in the process. Most clients just wanted to know when I'd be done. She wanted to understand why I chose quarter-sawn oak over plain sawn, why I used 16 screws in the door frame instead of the standard 8, why everything took so much longer when I did it. I was tightening the last set of hinges when my phone started buzzing with that emergency alert sound. You know the one, that harsh electronic screech that makes your blood run cold even when it's just a weather warning. Mrs. Henderson's television in the living room started blaring the same alert, then her radio in the kitchen, then what sounded like every electronic device in the neighborhood. The alert message was simple and terrifying. Seek immediate shelter. Avoid contact with infected individuals. This is not a test. It repeated 3 times, then cut to static. I dropped my drill and looked out the kitchen window toward the street, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Mr. Peterson from across the street was stumbling across his front lawn. At first, I thought he was drunk, which wouldn't have been unusual for a Friday evening. Peterson worked construction for one of the big development companies and had a reputation for celebrating the end of the work week. But something was wrong with how he moved, jerky and unnatural, like a marionette with tangled strings. His work shirt was torn and dark stains covered the front of it. That's when Mrs. Henderson screamed. I ran toward the sound, my work boots heavy on her pristine tile floor. She was standing frozen in her living room, pointing at the sliding glass door that led to her backyard pool area. Through the glass, I could see her neighbor, Mr. Garcia, pressed against the door from the outside. Now, Mr. Garcia was the sweetest old man you'd ever meet. He brought Mrs. Henderson tomatoes from his garden every summer and helped her with yard work when her arthritis was acting up. But the thing pressed against that glass door wasn't Mr. Garcia anymore. His face was gray-white, his eyes were completely black, and his mouth hung open, revealing teeth stained with something dark and wet. When he saw us looking at him, he started clawing at the glass, leaving bloody streaks as his fingernails scraped and tore against the surface. I'd reinforced that door frame just last month with extra screws and a steel security bar. Mrs. Henderson had worried it was overkill, but I'd explained that sliding doors are natural weak points in home security. 16 screws instead of the standard 8, grade 8 bolts instead of standard hardware, and a reinforcement plate that could withstand significant impact. My supervisor always called me obsessive about over-engineering simple jobs. Turns out obsessive keeps you breathing. The glass was holding, but Garcia kept clawing at it, and I could hear the frame creaking under the pressure. Mrs. Henderson grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my work shirt. "Vincent, what's wrong with him? Why is he doing this?" I didn't have an answer. I was staring at a man I'd shared coffee with just 2 weeks ago when I was working on the door installation, and now he looked like something from a horror movie. His movements were wrong, his eyes were wrong, and the sounds he was making weren't human. They were hungry, animal sounds that made every instinct in my body scream danger. Through the front window, I could see more neighbors stumbling around their yards. Mrs. Patterson from 2 houses down was chasing her own daughter across their driveway. The Johnsons' front door was standing wide open, and I could see movement inside that didn't look right. Emergency sirens were wailing in the distance, getting closer, but somehow I knew they weren't coming to help us. I grabbed Mrs. Henderson's shoulders and looked her in the eyes. "We need to get you out of here, right now. Do you have somewhere safe you can go?" She was shaking, tears streaming down her face, but she managed to nod. "My sister lives downtown near the hospital. There's an emergency shelter at the Civic Center. The radio said to go there." The radio had said a lot of things, most of them confusing and contradictory. But downtown sounded better than staying here with Garcia clawing at the door and Peterson stumbling around the front yard. I needed to get Mrs. Henderson somewhere safe, then figure out what the hell was happening to my city. I ran back to the kitchen and grabbed my grandfather's leather tool roll from where I'd set it on the counter. 3 generations of woodworkers had carried those tools, and my grandfather always said a craftsman is nothing without his tools. I had no idea how right he was, or how soon I'd need them for something other than carpentry. The tool roll contained hand tools that had been in my family since the 1940s. My great-grandfather's wood chisels, my grandfather's hand planes, and the marking gauge that had helped build half the custom furniture in Phoenix over the decades. They were made of good steel, built to last, and maintained with the kind of care that modern tools never got. In my business, these tools were priceless. In the next 72 hours, they'd be lifesavers. Mrs. Henderson was still standing in the living room, staring at Garcia through the glass. He'd stopped clawing and was now just standing there, swaying slightly, his black eyes fixed on us. It was somehow worse than the frantic clawing, like he was waiting for something or listening to something we couldn't hear. "Mrs. Henderson, we need to go. Get your purse, get your car keys, and meet me at your garage. Don't look at Garcia, just focus on getting ready to leave." She nodded and hurried toward her bedroom to gather her things. I took one last look around the kitchen I'd spent 3 weeks perfecting. The cabinets were beautiful, the installation was flawless, and it was work I'd been proud to put my name on. On the counter, I could see through the window to my truck parked in her driveway, and beyond that, the chaos spreading through the neighborhood. I thought about the unfinished rocking chair sitting in my workshop back home, the custom bookshelf I was designing for my nephew's birthday, and the kitchen table I'd been sketching for months but never found time to start. All those projects I'd been planning to finish next week, next month, someday when I had more time. I remember thinking I'd finish the rocking chair when I got home from this job. Funny how you never know when you're looking at your last normal moment. Mrs. Henderson came back carrying a small suitcase and her purse, her car keys jingling in her shaking hands. Through the front window, I could see that Peterson had wandered closer to our side of the street, and there were more figures moving in the shadows between houses. The emergency sirens were getting louder, but they seemed to be moving away from us rather than toward us. We made our way through her house toward the garage, staying away from windows. The garage was attached to the house through the laundry room, and I'd installed security lighting in there just last month as part of the overall renovation project. Motion sensors, LED floodlights, and a backup battery system in case of power outages. Another example of what Mrs. Henderson had called over-engineering, but which was starting to look like good planning. Her car was a 10-year-old Honda Civic, well-maintained and reliable. I helped her get settled in the driver's seat while I loaded my tools in the back seat. The garage door opener was electric, and I hesitated before pushing the button. Once that door went up, we'd be exposed to whatever was happening outside. The door rumbled open, and I got my first clear view of the neighborhood chaos. Cars were abandoned in the middle of the street, front doors were standing open, and people were wandering around in ways that didn't make sense. Some were running, some were walking with that same jerky, unnatural movement I'd seen from Peterson and Garcia. And some weren't moving at all, lying on lawns and driveways in positions that suggested they weren't getting back up. I climbed into the passenger seat and Mrs. Henderson started the engine. Her hands were still shaking, but she seemed focused on the task of driving. As we backed out of the garage, I got a closer look at Peterson. He was standing in the middle of the street now, and when he heard the car engine, his head snapped toward us with unnatural speed. His face had the same gray pallor as Garcia's, the same black eyes, the same hungry expression. Mrs. Henderson saw him too and let out a small whimper. "Vincent, what happened to them? What's wrong with everyone?" I didn't know how to answer that. I was a cabinet maker, not a doctor or a scientist. I knew how to join wood, how to read grain patterns, how to build things that would last. But I'd never seen anything like what was happening to our neighbors. The best I could offer was what my grandfather used to say about problems in the workshop. Take it one step at a time, focus on what you can control, and don't panic when things go wrong. We pulled out of the driveway and started driving toward the main road that would take us downtown. The radio was still broadcasting emergency messages, but they were contradictory and confusing. Some stations said to go to hospitals, others said to avoid hospitals. Some said the National Guard was setting up safe zones. Others said the military was overwhelmed and couldn't help. What they all agreed on was that people should stay indoors and avoid contact with anyone showing signs of infection. The problem was, nobody was explaining what those signs were, and from what I could see, the infection was spreading faster than the information about it. As we drove through the neighborhood, I kept thinking about patterns and systems, the same way I thought about wood grain when planning a difficult cut. Every piece of wood has a natural grain pattern that tells you how it will behave under stress, where its weak points are, and how to work with it rather than against it. The chaos outside was following patterns too. I just didn't understand them yet. We passed the gas station where I usually filled up my work truck, and it looked like it might still be functioning. The lights were on, and I could see someone moving around inside. Mrs. Henderson needed gas for the long drive downtown, and I figured it might be our last chance to fuel up before things got worse. I was starting to understand that things were definitely going to get worse. I noticed the station's security cameras were still working, their little red lights blinking like warning signals. In my line of work, you pay attention to details like that. Security systems, structural integrity, signs of wear or damage. These cameras were recording everything that was happening, storing it somewhere for someone to review later. I should have paid more attention to what they might be recording, because what was coming toward that gas station was going to change everything we thought we knew about survival. As Mrs. Henderson pulled into the gas station, I counted at least a dozen figures moving through the shadows of the surrounding area, all with that same unnatural, jerky movement pattern. They seemed to be drawn to sound and movement, but they weren't moving with any obvious coordination or intelligence. Just hunger, just need, just the drive to get to something they wanted. That gas station was about to become our first real test of whether my grandfather's lessons about planning for the worst-case scenario would be enough to keep us alive. And in the distance, moving slowly but steadily toward the bright lights and the sound of our car engine, I could see more of them coming. The gas station looked safe from a distance, but as we pulled up to the pumps, I started noticing details that made my craftsman's instincts kick in. The front door was propped open with a chair, which meant either the air conditioning was broken or someone was planning a quick escape. The windows had been covered with newspaper from the inside, blocking our view of what was happening in there. And most importantly, there were drag marks in the dirt leading around to the back of the building, dark stains that looked fresh. Mrs. Henderson put the car in park but kept the engine running. Smart thinking. In my line of work, you always keep your tools ready for the next job, and in this situation, our car was the most important tool we had. She started pumping gas while I kept watch, scanning the area for any of those jerky, unnatural movements I'd seen in the neighborhood. That's when I saw them coming out of the convenience store. Two people, but walking wrong, moving with that same hungry stumble as Peterson and Garcia. The man was wearing a gas station uniform, name tag still pinned to his shirt, but his face had that same gray pallor and his eyes were solid black. The woman with him was wearing a nurse's scrubs, probably getting off her shift at the hospital when whatever this was hit her. Mrs. Henderson saw them too, and her hand froze on the gas pump handle. I could hear her breathing getting faster, that kind of panic breathing that leads to bad decisions. In the workshop, panic makes you cut yourself or ruin expensive wood. Out here, panic could get us killed. Keep pumping, I told her quietly. Don't look directly at them, but don't ignore them either. Just keep doing what you're doing and be ready to move fast. The infected gas station attendant was moving toward us, but slowly, like he was having trouble coordinating his movements. The nurse was following behind him, and I could see bite marks on her arms, fresh wounds that were still bleeding. That told me something important. Whatever was causing this, it spread through bites, and it happened fast. I kept thinking about load-bearing walls and structural integrity. In my business, if you miscalculate weight distribution, a cabinet falls off the wall and ruins someone's kitchen. Here, if you miscalculate the threat level, everyone dies. These infected people were moving slowly, but there were two of them and more were probably coming. We needed to get out of there before we found out how many more. The gas pump clicked off, signaling a full tank. Mrs. Henderson started to replace the nozzle, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it. I reached over and helped her, keeping one eye on the approaching infected and one eye on the growing shadows around the gas station perimeter. That's when I heard voices from inside the convenience store. Human voices, not the hungry animal sounds the infected were making. There were other survivors in there, and from the sound of it, they were in trouble. My grandfather always taught me that a good craftsman helps his community, that skills are meant to be shared and people should look out for each other. But my grandfather never faced zombies. I made a decision that probably saved our lives and definitely changed everything that came next. Instead of getting back in the car and driving away, I told Mrs. Henderson to pull around to the side of the building where the car would be less visible from the road. Then I grabbed my tool roll and went to help whoever was trapped inside that store. The front door was indeed propped open, and I could see inside well enough to assess the situation. Two people were barricaded behind the counter, using cases of beer and bags of ice as makeshift barriers. A young man, maybe 22 years old, wearing a college t-shirt that was torn and bloody, and a woman in her 30s wearing medical scrubs but different from the infected nurse outside. This one was alert, responsive, and very much alive. The college kid looked up when I appeared in the doorway. "Are you bit? Please tell me you're not bit." "Not bit," I replied, stepping inside and quickly assessing their defensive position. But there are 2 infected outside and more coming. We need to get you out of here." The woman in scrubs extended her hand. "Maria Santos, I'm a paramedic. This is Jake Peterson." She paused, noting my expression. "Different Peterson from your neighbor, I'm guessing." Jake was buying energy drinks when this whole thing started. "We've been trapped in here for about 3 hours." 3 hours. That meant the outbreak had been spreading while I was still installing cabinet hinges, completely unaware that the world was falling apart. Maria had medical training, which made her invaluable in this situation. Jake looked young and scared, but he also looked physically capable. If we were going to survive this, we needed every advantage we could get. I started looking around the store with the same analytical approach I used when planning a complex cabinet installation. What resources were available? What were the weak points? What could be reinforced or improved? The store had thick walls, limited entry points, and plenty of supplies. But the windows were large and vulnerable, and there was no back exit that I could see. "Have you been listening to the radio?" I asked Maria while I examined the front barricade they'd built. "Some. The reports are all over the place. They're saying it started in the major cities and spread outward. Hospitals are overwhelmed. Military is setting up quarantine zones, but nobody seems to know what's actually causing this or how to stop it." She gestured toward Jake. "He was heading home from Arizona State when his car broke down here. Wrong place, wrong time." Jake spoke up, his voice shaky but determined. "My roommate texted me before the cell towers went down. Said people were attacking each other on campus, biting and clawing like animals. Security tried to contain it, but there were too many of them. That was 4 hours ago. 4 hours from outbreak to total campus chaos. That suggested this thing spread exponentially, not linearly. In construction, you learn about stress points and cascade failures. When one support beam fails, it puts extra stress on the remaining beams, which makes them more likely to fail, which creates a domino effect. That's what was happening to society. Every person who got infected became a vector for infecting more people, and the system was collapsing under the exponential load." Maria was examining bite wounds on Jake's arm, cleaning them with supplies she'd found in the store's first aid section. The wounds looked like human bite marks, but deeper and more savage than anything you'd see in a normal fight. She was using techniques I recognized from workplace first aid training, but she was also checking things I didn't understand. Temperature, pupil response, reflexes. "The bites are causing some kind of systemic failure," she explained when she noticed me watching. "Fever, disorientation, aggression, then complete loss of higher brain function. I've seen 3 cases so far, and they all followed the same pattern. The incubation period seems to be anywhere from 30 minutes to 6 hours, depending on the severity of the bite and the victim's overall health." I thought about all the times I'd cut myself on sharp wood edges and kept working, cleaning the wound and moving on. This was different. This was permanent. Every bite was potentially a death sentence, and worse than death, it was a transformation into something that would bite others. From outside, I could hear Mrs. Henderson's car engine still running, which was reassuring. But I could also hear more of those hungry, animal sounds, which meant more infected were gathering in the area. The gas station's bright lights and our engine noise were drawing them like moths to a flame. Jake was getting restless, pacing behind the counter and peering out through gaps in the newspaper-covered windows. "We can't stay here forever. What if they break in? What if more of them come?" He had a point. The front barricade was solid enough to stop the slow-moving infected we'd seen so far, but it wouldn't hold against a large group, and it definitely wouldn't stop anyone with enough intelligence to find another way in. I was starting to realize that not all infected were the same. The ones outside were moving like their motor skills were damaged, but they were still problem-solving enough to follow sound and movement. I started reinforcing their barricade using principles I'd learned from building custom furniture. Weight distribution, structural integrity, multiple failure points that would slow down any breach attempt. Cases of beer became foundation weight. Bags of ice provided flexible barriers that would absorb impact, and metal shelving units created a framework that distributed stress across multiple anchor points. Maria was impressed with the improvements. You know what you're doing. Construction. Cabinetmaker. But the principles are the same. You build something to handle more stress than you think it'll ever face, because you never know when worst-case scenario becomes reality. While I worked on the barricade, Maria shared what she'd learned from the radio broadcasts and her own medical observations. The infection seemed to attack the central nervous system first, causing the fever and disorientation. Then it affected motor control, creating the jerky, uncoordinated movement we'd observed. Finally, it shut down higher brain functions while leaving basic drives intact. Hunger, aggression, the need to spread the infection. Jake was monitoring the situation outside through a small gap in one of the windows. There are more of them now. I count at least 6 moving around out there, and I think I see more coming down the road. 6 infected, plus however many more were on the way. Our car could probably get us past 6, but if that number kept growing, we'd need a different plan. I started thinking about escape routes and fallback positions, the same way I thought about contingency plans when a woodworking project went wrong. The convenience store had everything we needed for short-term survival: food, water, basic medical supplies, and defensible positions. But it also had major vulnerabilities. Too much glass, only one exit, and no way to know what was happening in the larger area. We were reacting to immediate threats without understanding the bigger picture. Maria had found a small battery-powered radio behind the counter, and she was scanning through stations trying to find current information. Most stations were either off the air or playing automated emergency messages, but she found one station that seemed to be broadcasting live updates from downtown Phoenix. The news wasn't good. The emergency shelter at the Civic Center was overrun. The hospital district was under quarantine, with military checkpoints preventing anyone from entering or leaving. Major highways out of the city were blocked with abandoned vehicles. And the infection rate was accelerating, with new cases being reported faster than authorities could process them. "We need to get out of the city," Maria said after listening to several reports. Rural areas seem to be less affected, probably because there's more space between people and infections can't spread as quickly. Jake shook his head. "My car's dead, remember, and even if we could get it running, the roads are blocked." That's when I thought about my work truck, still parked in Mrs. Henderson's driveway. It was a heavy-duty pickup with 4-wheel drive, designed for hauling construction materials over rough terrain. It could probably get us around road blockages that would stop a regular car. But getting back to Mrs. Henderson's house meant driving through neighborhoods that were probably swarming with infected by now. From outside, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Not the individual moans and growls we'd been hearing, but a collective noise, like a crowd at a sporting event. Except this crowd was hungry, angry, and getting closer to our location. Jake's face went pale. "That sounds like a lot more than 6. I looked out through the gap in the newspaper and saw what Jake meant. The infected were gathering in the gas station parking lot, drawn by our lights and sounds. But they weren't just wandering randomly anymore. They were congregating, moving in loose groups, almost like they were coordinating their movements. Not intelligent coordination, but some kind of pack behavior that made them more dangerous than individual infected. Maria checked her watch. It's been almost 5 hours since the first reports. If the infection rate is exponential, we could be looking at thousands of infected in the Phoenix area by now. Thousands. That number hit me like a sledgehammer. I've been thinking about this as a neighborhood problem, something that would be contained and managed by authorities. But if Maria was right, we weren't dealing with a local emergency. We were dealing with the collapse of civilization. I started planning our next moves with the same systematic approach I used for complex furniture projects. First priority, immediate safety. We needed to get out of the gas station before we were completely surrounded. Second priority, transportation. We needed vehicles that could handle rough terrain and carry supplies. Third priority, destination. We needed somewhere defensible with access to resources. But first, we had to deal with the growing crowd outside. I counted at least 20 infected now, with more arriving every few minutes. They were pressing against the windows, testing the door barricade, and making those collective hungry sounds that suggested they knew we were in here. Jake was getting more agitated, pacing faster and checking his phone every few seconds even though the cell towers were down. Maria was organizing medical supplies and checking our food and water supplies. And I was calculating load-bearing capacities and failure points, trying to determine how long our barricades would hold against sustained pressure. That's when the front window cracked. It started as a small spider web pattern in the lower corner, probably from one of the infected pressing too hard against the glass. But I knew from experience that once glass starts to fail, the failure spreads quickly. That crack was going to grow, and when it did, our defensible position would become a trap. I made another decision that probably saved our lives. Instead of waiting for the window to fail completely, I started preparing for a fighting retreat. I gathered weapons from around the store, a baseball bat from the sports section, a heavy flashlight that could serve as a club, and a knife from the camping supplies. Not much, but better than facing infected barehanded. Maria understood immediately. "We're leaving, aren't we? We're leaving. The window won't hold much longer and there are too many of them to fight from a fixed position. We need mobility." Jake looked terrified but nodded. "Where are we going?" I thought about Mrs. Henderson waiting in her car, probably watching the infected gather around the gas station and wondering if we were ever coming out. I thought about my work truck with its heavy-duty suspension and four-wheel drive capability. And I thought about the Home Depot I'd visited that morning to pick up hardware for Mrs. Henderson's cabinet job. "Home Depot," I said. "Big building, multiple exits, and everything we need to build better defenses. Plus, it's got a garden center with high fences and loading docks for vehicle access." Maria and Jake looked at each other, then back at me. "That's actually not a bad idea," Maria said. "Medical supplies, tools, materials for barricades, and multiple escape routes if we need them." The crack in the front window was growing, spreading up and across like a slow-motion spiderweb. Outside, the infected were getting more agitated, pressing harder against the glass and making louder sounds. We had maybe 10 minutes before the window failed completely. I started thinking about escape routes and timing, the same way I thought about complex cuts that required multiple tool changes and precise sequencing. First, we'd have to get past the infected at the front of the store. Then we'd have to reach Mrs. Henderson's car without getting separated or surrounded. Then we'd have to drive through increasingly dangerous streets to reach a destination that might not be any safer than where we were now. But staying here meant certain death when that window failed. Moving meant uncertainty, but uncertainty was better than the certainty of being trapped with no escape route. I grabbed my grandfather's tool roll and prepared to find out whether 3 generations of woodworking tools would be enough to keep us alive in a world where the dead had started walking. The crack in the window spread a little wider, and outside, the collective sound of hungry infected grew a little louder. It was time to move. The window finally gave way just as we were preparing to leave. Not a dramatic explosion of glass, but a slow collapse that started at the crack and spread across the entire surface in about 30 seconds. The infected outside pressed forward immediately, their hands and faces pushing through the opening, reaching for us with single-minded hunger. I swung the baseball bat at the first hand that came through, connecting solidly and hearing bones break. The infected didn't react to the pain, didn't pull back or cry out. It just kept reaching with its broken hand, trying to grab anything it could. That taught me something important about what we were facing. Pain wasn't going to stop them. Fear wasn't going to stop them. Only complete physical incapacitation would stop them. Jake was behind me with the heavy flashlight, and Maria had grabbed a crowbar from the hardware section. We formed a defensive line at the counter while the infected struggled to climb through the window opening. The newspaper we'd used to block the view was actually helping us now, creating obstacles that slowed their entry and gave us time to strike before they could fully enter the store. "Mrs. Henderson," I called toward the side door. "Start the car and be ready to move fast." I could hear her engine rev in response, which meant she was still there and still alert. That was one less thing to worry about. Now we just had to fight our way past 20 infected, reach the car, and drive through streets that were probably filled with more of them. Simple. The first infected managed to climb all the way through the window, a middle-aged man in a business suit who'd probably been driving home from work when this started. His tie was still perfectly knotted, but his face was gray and his eyes were solid black. I hit him in the head with the bat, putting all my weight behind the swing like I was driving a splitting wedge through a particularly stubborn piece of oak. He went down and stayed down. Another lesson learned. Head trauma worked. These things might not feel pain, but they still had brains, and if you damaged the brain enough, they stopped functioning. It wasn't pleasant knowledge, but it was practical knowledge, and practical knowledge was what kept you alive. Jake got the next one, a teenage girl in a fast food uniform. His flashlight connected with her temple and she collapsed immediately. Maria used the crowbar to trip the third infected, then finished him while he was on the ground. We were developing a rhythm, a system for dealing with the threat, but more were coming through the window faster than we could handle them. "We need to move now," I said, leading the way toward the side door where Mrs. Henderson was waiting. "Stay together, watch each other's backs, and don't stop moving no matter what happens." We fought our way through the store, using the aisles to funnel the infected into single file where we could deal with them one at a time. Jake was learning quickly, using his youth and athleticism to stay mobile, while Maria used her medical knowledge to target the most effective strike points. I used my experience with tools and leverage to make every swing count. The side door opened onto a small loading area where Mrs. Henderson had positioned her car. She turned it around so we could get in quickly and drive straight out toward the main road. Smart thinking under pressure. The loading area was clear of infected for the moment, but I could see more approaching from around the building. We ran for the car, throwing our weapons and supplies into the back seat. I took the passenger seat while Maria and Jake crowded into the back with my tool roll and the medical supplies Maria had gathered. Mrs. Henderson had the car moving before we'd even closed the doors. "Where to?" she asked, her voice steady despite everything she'd witnessed. "Home Depot on Thomas Road," I replied. "Big building, multiple exits, and everything we need to build better defenses." As we drove away from the gas station, I looked back to see infected pouring out of the broken window, stumbling around the parking lot in confusion. They'd lost track of us once we were inside the car, which suggested their hunting abilities were limited to direct sight and sound. Another useful piece of information for future reference. The streets were chaos. Abandoned cars everywhere, some with doors standing open and dark stains on the seats. Emergency vehicles scattered around, many of them damaged or overturned. And infected wandering through it all, some alone, some in groups, all moving with that same hungry, uncoordinated purpose. Mrs. Henderson was a good driver under pressure, weaving between abandoned vehicles and avoiding the larger groups of infected. But I could see her hands shaking on the steering wheel, and she kept looking in the rearview mirror like she expected to see infected chasing us. "They can't run," I told her. "At least not the ones we've seen so far. As long as we keep moving and don't get trapped, we should be able to stay ahead of them." Jake was monitoring the radio, scanning through channels for any useful information. Most stations were still off the air, but he found one broadcasting from what sounded like a military command post. The news wasn't encouraging. Major cities across the country were reporting similar outbreaks. International flights had been suspended. The president had declared a national emergency and authorized the use of military force to contain the infection. "Contain the infection how?" Maria asked. You can't bomb your way out of a biological crisis. That was when we heard the first helicopters, military aircraft flying low over the city. At first, I thought it was a rescue operation, but then I noticed they were flying in formation toward specific neighborhoods, the same neighborhoods where the initial outbreaks had been reported. Jake's radio crackled with fragments of military communications, code words and coordinates that didn't mean much to civilians but sounded ominous. The Home Depot came into view about 15 minutes after we left the gas station. It was a massive building surrounded by a large parking lot, with a garden center enclosed by high chain-link fencing. From a distance, it looked intact and unoccupied. But as we got closer, I could see that the main entrance doors had been broken open, and there were drag marks in the parking lot leading in multiple directions. Someone else had the same idea, Maria observed. I was studying the building with the same analytical approach I used when planning a complex installation. Multiple entry points, including the main entrance, the garden center gates, and at least 2 emergency exits I could see from the parking lot. High windows that would be difficult for infected to reach. Concrete construction that would resist damage. And most importantly, loading docks in the back that could accommodate vehicles. We parked near the garden center entrance, which seemed to have the least activity around it. The chain-link fence was intact, and the gates were closed but not locked. Through the fence, I could see garden supplies, outdoor furniture, and most importantly, no movement that suggested infected presence. We go in through the garden center, I decided. Easier to control access, better visibility of the surrounding area, and multiple escape routes if things go wrong. As we approached the garden center gates, I noticed something that made my craftsman's instincts kick in. The fence had been reinforced recently, with additional wire mesh and steel posts that weren't part of the original installation. Someone with construction knowledge had been here before us and had taken steps to improve the defenses. Jake pushed open the gates and we entered the garden center as a group, weapons ready and staying close together. The space was about 2 acres, filled with plants, garden supplies, and outdoor furniture displays. More importantly, it was completely enclosed and easily defensible. Someone had definitely been planning ahead. That's when we met the others. A voice called out from behind a display of patio furniture. "Stop right there and state your business." I raised my hands to show I wasn't holding a weapon. We're survivors looking for shelter. We're not infected, we're not hostile, and we have medical supplies and construction knowledge that might be useful. 3 people emerged from behind the furniture display. A man in his 50s wearing a Home Depot apron, a woman about my age in work clothes, and a teenager who looked like he might be the woman's son. All 3 were armed with tools from the store. A sledgehammer, a crowbar, and a nail gun that had probably been modified for use as a weapon. The man in the apron spoke first. "I'm Dave, assistant manager here. This is Linda and her son Marcus. We've been here since about 8 o'clock this morning when things started getting bad in this area." 8 o'clock this morning. That was almost 12 hours ago, which meant they'd been dealing with this situation longer than any of us. Dave had management experience and knowledge of the store layout. Linda looked competent and tough, and Marcus seemed alert and capable despite his age. If we were going to survive this, we needed every advantage we could get. I introduced our group and explained what we'd witnessed at the gas station and in the neighborhoods. Dave listened carefully, asking practical questions about infection rates, incubation periods, and the behavior patterns we'd observed. He was thinking like a manager, trying to assess resources and plan for multiple contingencies. "We've been monitoring the radio and making improvements to the defenses," Linda said. "The fence was already good, but we reinforced it with steel mesh and added some obstacles to slow down anything that tries to climb over." She led us on a tour of their defensive improvements, and I was impressed with the quality of the work. These weren't desperate improvisations thrown together in panic. They were well-planned modifications that showed understanding of structural engineering and tactical thinking. Linda obviously had construction experience, and Marcus seemed to have inherited both her practical skills and her level-headed approach to problem-solving. The main store was a different story. Dave explained that they'd sealed most of the entrances and were using only the garden center and a small section of the main floor that connected to it. The rest of the building was too large to secure effectively with only 3 people, but it contained everything they might need for an extended siege. Food, water, tools, building materials, camping supplies, and enough hardware to build a fortress if we need to, Dave said. The problem is, we're not the only ones who figured out that this was a good place to hide. He led us to a window that overlooked the main parking lot, and I could see what he meant. There were other groups of survivors in the area, some taking shelter in abandoned vehicles, others trying to break into nearby buildings. Not all of them looked friendly, and some of them were watching the Home Depot with obvious interest. Competition for resources, Maria said grimly. In a crisis situation, other survivors can be more dangerous than the infected. That was something I hadn't considered. I'd been focused on the immediate threat of the infected, but Maria was right. When civilization collapses, people revert to survival mode, and that doesn't always bring out the best in human nature. We needed to be prepared for conflicts with other survivor groups as well as with the infected. Dave had been thinking along the same lines. We've been trying to stay low profile, not drawing attention to how well supplied and defended this place is. But word gets around, and some of the groups out there are getting desperate. As if to illustrate his point, we heard vehicles approaching from the main road. Multiple engines, moving fast and headed directly toward the Home Depot. Dave motioned for everyone to take cover behind the garden center displays, while he peered through the fence to assess the situation. 3 pickup trucks pulled into the parking lot, and armed men jumped out of each vehicle. Not infected, but not friendly either. They moved with military precision, spreading out to cover multiple approaches to the building. These weren't desperate survivors looking for shelter. These were organized raiders looking for supplies and territory. 12 men, all armed, Dave whispered. They're setting up a perimeter around the main entrance. Looks like they're planning to take this place by force. I started calculating defensive positions and escape routes the same way I calculated load-bearing requirements for heavy cabinet installations. The garden center had good sight lines and multiple exit points, but it wouldn't stand up to sustained assault from a dozen armed men. We needed to either negotiate, retreat, or prepare for a fight we probably couldn't win. But retreat meant giving up the best defensive position we'd found, and negotiation meant dealing with people who'd chosen violence as their first option. That left fighting, and fighting meant using every advantage we could get our hands on. Linda was already moving toward the tool displays, gathering weapons and passing them out to everyone in our group. Marcus was checking the fence line for weak points where attackers might try to enter. And Dave was monitoring the raiders' movements while trying to stay out of sight. Mrs. Henderson looked terrified, but she was also determined. "What do you need me to do?" I thought about my grandfather's lessons about craftsmanship and community. A good craftsman shares his skills and helps his neighbors. But my grandfather never faced armed raiders in a zombie apocalypse. Still, the principles remained the same. Work together, use the tools available, and build something strong enough to protect what matters. "We're going to make this place into a fortress," I told her, "and we're going to do it fast." Outside the fence, the raiders were moving closer to the garden center, and I could hear them talking about the best way to breach our defenses. We had maybe 10 minutes before they made their move, and 10 minutes to turn a garden center into a defensible position that could protect 7 people against 12 armed attackers. I grabbed my grandfather's tool roll and started planning the most important construction project of my life. One that would determine whether we lived to see another day or became just another casualty of the collapse. The raiders gave us exactly 8 minutes before they started their assault on the garden center. 8 minutes to turn a retail space into a fortress, using nothing but garden supplies and the tools we could grab from nearby displays. In my normal work, I'd spend 8 minutes just measuring for a single cabinet door. Here, 8 minutes had to be enough to save 7 lives. I directed everyone to specific tasks based on their abilities. Dave knew the store layout and could find the materials we needed fastest. Linda had construction experience and could implement defensive modifications. Marcus was young and strong, perfect for moving heavy materials. Maria could organize medical supplies and plan for treating injuries. Jake could monitor the raiders' movements and give us updates on their timing. Mrs. Henderson could coordinate supplies and make sure we had everything within reach. The raiders were professional, but they were also overconfident. They assumed they were dealing with desperate civilians who'd panic under pressure. They didn't know they were dealing with people who'd spent their careers solving complex problems under tight deadlines. In construction, missing a deadline costs money. Here, missing our deadline would cost lives. I used the same systematic approach I'd use for any complex installation. First, assess the existing structure and identify weak points. The garden center fence was strong but had large gaps at ground level where someone could crawl through. The gates were the obvious entry points, but they were also the easiest to reinforce. The main vulnerability was the section of fence closest to the main store, where raiders could use the building for cover while cutting through the chain link. Second, prioritize improvements based on available time and materials. We couldn't make the entire perimeter impregnable, but we could create choke points that forced attackers to approach from predictable directions. Garden center displays could be repositioned to create firing positions and cover. Bags of mulch and concrete could reinforce weak sections of fence, and the sprinkler system could be modified to create obstacles for anyone trying to enter. Third, implement changes in order of importance and complexity. Start with quick fixes that provided immediate improvement, then work toward more sophisticated modifications if time allowed. Every minute we spent improving our defenses was a minute the raiders spent getting impatient and possibly making mistakes. Dave returned from his supply run with everything I'd requested: steel mesh, zip ties, concrete blocks, and several wheelbarrows full of tools and hardware. Linda started reinforcing the main gate using techniques that showed real understanding of structural engineering. Marcus began moving bags of mulch to create firing positions behind the main displays. The raiders were getting organized, spreading out to cover all possible escape routes from the garden center. Their leader was a big man with military bearing who moved like he'd done this before. He was directing his men to positions that would give them overlapping fields of fire while minimizing their exposure to return fire. These weren't desperate scavengers. These were experienced fighters who developed tactics for taking fortified positions. "They're moving to assault positions," Jake reported from his observation post behind a display of outdoor furniture. "Looks like they're planning to hit us from 3 directions simultaneously." That was smart tactics, but it also spread their forces across a wider area. If we could concentrate our defensive fire at one breakthrough point, we might be able to repel the attack long enough for them to reconsider their approach. The key was making sure we didn't get overwhelmed at multiple points simultaneously. I positioned our people to cover the 3 most likely assault routes: the main gate, the section of fence nearest the building, and the loading dock area where vehicles could be used for cover. Each position had good fields of fire, adequate cover, and fallback positions if the primary defensive line was breached. Mrs. Henderson surprised me by requesting a specific assignment rather than waiting to be told what to do. I may be 68 years old, but I can still shoot. My husband taught me to use his hunting rifle before he passed, and I've been practicing at the range every month since then. That changed our defensive equation significantly. 7 defenders instead of 6, and one of them with actual firearms training. Dave had found several nail guns in the tool section, and Linda had modified them to fire standard nails as projectiles. Not as effective as real firearms, but deadly at close range and intimidating enough to make attackers think twice. The raiders made their move at exactly 10 minutes past 8 o'clock in the evening. 3 groups of 4 men each, approaching from the directions we'd anticipated. Their leader stayed back to coordinate the assault, which meant he was experienced enough to avoid unnecessary personal risk. That suggested these men had been working together for a while and had developed effective small unit tactics. The first breach attempt came at the main gate, where 2 raiders with bolt cutters started working on the chain-link reinforcements Linda had installed. She'd done good work, using hardened steel mesh that would take time to cut through, but the raiders were persistent and well-equipped. They were making progress, and we needed to discourage them before they created a gap large enough to enter. Mrs. Henderson took the first shot with Dave's hunting rifle, aiming for the bolt cutters rather than the men using them. The shot connected, sending sparks flying and destroying the cutting tool. The raiders pulled back temporarily, but they had backup equipment and returned within minutes. At least we'd bought ourselves some time and demonstrated that we were willing and able to fight back. The second assault group was working on the fence section nearest the building, using the structure for cover while they cut through the chain link. This was the approach I'd been most worried about, because once they breached that section, they'd have a clear path to our defensive positions. Linda had reinforced the area with concrete blocks and steel mesh, but determined attackers with the right tools would eventually get through. Jake was monitoring this group with a modified nail gun, waiting for them to expose themselves enough for an effective shot. He was learning to think tactically, using cover and concealment the same way he'd probably learned to use strategy in video games. The difference was that here, mistakes had permanent consequences. The third group was approaching from the loading dock area, using abandoned vehicles for cover and trying to find a way over or through the fence without exposing themselves to our defensive fire. This was the most cautious group, which suggested they'd encountered serious resistance before and had learned to respect defensive positions. Maria was coordinating our response from a central position where she could move to reinforce whichever defensive point came under the most pressure. She'd organized medical supplies for treating injuries, but she was also armed and ready to fight. Her medical training gave her knowledge of human anatomy that translated directly into understanding the most effective ways to disable attackers. The breakthrough came at the fence section nearest the building, where the raiders had managed to cut a gap large enough for one person to crawl through. The first man through was met by Jake's nail gun, which disabled him immediately. But the second man made it through and found cover behind a display of garden tools, putting him inside our defensive perimeter. That forced us to shift tactics from defense to internal security, hunting an armed intruder while still maintaining our positions against external assault. Marcus left his position at the loading dock to help Jake deal with the breach, which weakened our coverage of that approach, but was necessary to prevent the raiders from establishing a foothold inside the garden center. The raider inside our perimeter was experienced and dangerous, using the garden center displays for cover while he tried to work his way toward our main defensive positions. He was armed with a pistol and had military-style equipment, which suggested he'd been part of an organized group before the outbreak. These men weren't random looters. They were what was left of some kind of security or military unit that had gone rogue when civilization collapsed. I moved to intercept the intruder using my knowledge of the garden center layout and the principles I'd learned from years of working in confined spaces. In construction, you learn to move efficiently through cluttered areas while carrying tools and materials. Those same skills applied to tactical movement through the garden center displays. The confrontation happened near the fertilizer section, where the intruder had taken cover behind bags of lawn chemicals. I approached from his blind side, using a display of lawn mowers for concealment. When I had a clear angle, I used my grandfather's wood chisel, throwing it like a projectile at the hand holding his weapon. The chisel connected, causing him to drop the pistol and giving me the opportunity to close distance with the crowbar I'd taken from our defensive supplies. The fight was brief and decisive. He was trained for military combat, but I was fighting for the survival of people who'd become my responsibility. That made the difference. With the internal threat neutralized, we could focus on the external assault again. But the raiders had used the distraction to advance their other breakthrough attempts. The main gate was showing signs of structural failure where they'd been cutting through Linda's reinforcements, and the loading dock group had found a way to climb over the fence using vehicle roofs as stepping stones. Mrs. Henderson was proving to be an excellent shot, but she was running low on ammunition. Dave and Linda were holding the main gate, but they were outnumbered and under increasing pressure. Marcus and Jake were trying to cover two different approaches simultaneously, which meant neither position was adequately defended. We were reaching the point where our defensive line was going to collapse, and when it did, we'd be trapped in the garden center with nowhere to retreat. That's when Maria made a suggestion that changed everything. "The sprinkler system," she said. "If we can activate the fire suppression system for the main store, it might create enough chaos and confusion to disrupt their assault." The main store's fire suppression system was connected to the garden center through underground pipes, and Dave knew how to activate it manually from the garden center control panel. Water wouldn't stop the raiders, but it would reduce visibility, create slippery surfaces, and force them to deal with an unexpected complication while they were trying to coordinate their assault. Dave activated the system, and within seconds, water was pouring down throughout the main store and overflowing into the parking lot. The raiders at the main gate found themselves standing in rapidly rising water, which made their footing unstable and their equipment harder to use. The loading dock group had to abandon their climbing attempt because the vehicle roofs became too slippery to stand on. The distraction gave us the opportunity we needed to reorganize our defenses and prepare for what was probably going to be their final assault. They'd committed significant resources to taking this position, and backing down now would mean admitting defeat to a group of civilians. Their leader wouldn't accept that kind of loss of face, which meant they'd escalate their tactics rather than withdraw. That's when we heard the helicopters again, closer this time and moving in our direction. Military aircraft, flying low and fast, heading directly toward the Home Depot. At first, I thought it might be a rescue operation, but then I remembered the radio broadcasts about containment operations and authorized use of military force. The raiders heard the helicopters too, and their assault faltered as they tried to figure out whether this was reinforcement for us or a threat to everyone in the area. Their leader called for a tactical withdrawal, pulling his men back to their vehicles while keeping weapons trained on our positions. "Military's coming," Dave said, watching the helicopters approach. "Question is, are they here to help survivors or eliminate infection vectors?" That was a question I didn't want to know the answer to. We'd survived the infected, we'd survived the raiders, but we might not survive our own military if they decided that the only way to contain the outbreak was to eliminate everyone in the affected areas. The helicopters passed overhead without stopping, continuing toward what looked like the downtown area where the initial outbreaks had been reported. But their presence had ended the immediate threat from the raiders, who were apparently unwilling to risk a confrontation with military forces. As the raiders drove away, I realized that we'd won a tactical victory but lost strategic security. They knew where we were, they knew our defensive capabilities, and they'd be back with more men and better equipment. We'd bought ourselves time, but we hadn't solved the fundamental problem of competing with other survivor groups for limited resources. Mrs. Henderson was checking on everyone, making sure no one had been seriously injured during the fighting. She'd proven herself under fire, showing courage and competence that had probably saved all our lives. The scared elderly woman from the kitchen installation had become a crucial member of our survival team. But Mrs. Henderson was also showing signs of exhaustion and stress that worried me. She'd been through more trauma in the past 12 hours than most people experience in a lifetime. The fever she'd been fighting since the gas station was getting worse, and she was having trouble staying focused on conversations. Maria was monitoring Mrs. Henderson's condition with growing concern. Her temperature is elevated, and she's showing signs of disorientation. If she was exposed to infected blood during the fighting, we could be looking at infection. That was the possibility I'd been dreading since the gas station. Mrs. Henderson had been bitten by one of the infected while we were fighting our way out of the convenience store. The wound was small and we'd cleaned it immediately, but Maria had explained that the infection could take anywhere from 30 minutes to 6 hours to manifest symptoms. It had been almost 6 hours since the bite. I watched Mrs. Henderson carefully, looking for the signs Maria had described: fever, disorientation, changes in behavior or speech patterns. She was definitely running a fever, and she was having trouble following complex conversations. But she was still responsive, still recognizably herself, still capable of making rational decisions. "How long do we have?" I asked Maria quietly. "If she's infected, probably 12 hours from onset of symptoms, maybe less if the infection progresses rapidly. We need to be prepared for the possibility that she might turn." Prepared. That was a clinical way of saying we needed to be ready to kill someone who'd become part of our family over the past few hours. Someone who'd risked her life to help strangers and had proven herself brave and capable under impossible circumstances. I thought about my unfinished projects back home, all the things I'd planned to complete someday when I had more time. The rocking chair, the custom bookshelf, the kitchen table I'd been designing for months. All those things I'd never finished now. All those normal problems that seemed insignificant compared to the decision I might have to make about Mrs. Henderson. But maybe that was okay. Maybe those projects didn't matter anymore. Maybe what mattered was this: helping people survive, building defenses that protected the innocent, and making the hard choices that kept communities alive when civilization collapsed. The garden center was secure for now, but the raiders would be back. The infected were still out there, probably in growing numbers. And somewhere in the distance, military helicopters were making decisions about containment that might affect every survivor in the Phoenix area. Mrs. Henderson asked me to make her a promise, the same promise she'd asked for at the gas station. She wanted me to make sure she didn't hurt anyone if the infection took hold. She wanted me to end her suffering before she became something that would threaten the people we were trying to protect. It was the kind of promise that changes you, the kind of decision that separates normal life from survival mode. I thought about my grandfather's lessons about craftsmanship and community, about building things that last and helping your neighbors. This was both, in the most terrible way imaginable. Outside the garden center, the sun was setting on what had been the longest day of my life. Somewhere in the darkness, the infected were gathering. Somewhere in the distance, other survivor groups were planning their next moves. And somewhere inside our defensive perimeter, a good woman was fighting a battle she probably couldn't win. The first 72 hours weren't over yet, and the hardest choices were still ahead. Mrs. Henderson's condition deteriorated through the night. By midnight, her fever had spiked, and she was having difficulty maintaining coherent conversations. Maria monitored her vital signs while the rest of us maintained watch shifts around the garden center perimeter. The raiders hadn't returned, but we could see lights moving in the distance, other survivor groups searching for resources or territory. I spent the dark hours thinking about everything that had happened since I'd walked into Mrs. Henderson's kitchen that Friday evening. 72 hours ago, my biggest concern was whether the cabinet hinges would align properly. Now I was calculating how long our water supplies would last and whether we had enough weapons to defend against the next assault. The infected were still out there, wandering through the streets in growing numbers. We could hear them sometimes, that collective sound of hunger and need that carried for miles in the still night air. But they seemed to avoid the Home Depot area, possibly because of the bright security lighting or because there were easier targets elsewhere in the city. Around 3 in the morning, Mrs. Henderson asked to speak with me privately. Her voice was weak but clear, and her eyes still held the intelligence and kindness I'd come to respect over our brief but intense partnership. "Vincent, I need you to understand something. What's happening to me, it's not your fault. You've done everything you could to help me, and you've kept me alive longer than I had any right to expect." She paused, gathering strength for what came next. "But I can feel it changing me. My thoughts are getting harder to control, and I'm starting to have urges that aren't mine." I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that she was going to recover, that we'd find a way to treat the infection. But my grandfather had taught me that honest craftsmanship meant facing facts, even when the facts were unpleasant. Mrs. Henderson was infected, and the infection was progressing exactly as Maria had predicted. "What do you need me to do?" I asked. "When the time comes, don't hesitate. Don't try to save me or find alternatives. Just do what needs to be done quickly and cleanly." She reached into her purse and pulled out something wrapped in a handkerchief. This was my husband's wedding ring. He made it himself in a metalworking class when we were young. It was made to last forever, just like the promises people make. She pressed the ring into my hand. "I want you to have it, not as payment or obligation, but as a reminder that good people can still make things that endure, even when everything else is falling apart." The ring was simple but beautifully crafted, the kind of work that showed real understanding of materials and techniques. It reminded me of my grandfather's tools, made with care and built to last far beyond the lifetime of their creator. In a world where everything was temporary and disposable, this ring represented permanence and commitment. Dawn brought new challenges. The radio reports were becoming more fragmented and contradictory, but the overall pattern was clear. Major cities were falling to the infection, government services were collapsing, and military units were focusing on protecting strategic assets rather than rescuing civilians. We were on our own, and we needed to plan for long-term survival rather than short-term rescue. Dave had been cataloging our resources and calculating consumption rates. Food and water for 7 people, medical supplies for treating injuries, tools and materials for maintaining and improving our defenses. We had enough for maybe 2 weeks if we were careful, longer if we could find ways to supplement our supplies. Linda and Marcus had been working on expanding our defensive perimeter to include sections of the main store. Their goal was to create a larger secure area with better access to supplies and more options for fallback positions if the garden center was breached. The work was slow because they had to clear each section of potential infected and secure all entry points. Jake had established himself as our communications specialist, monitoring radio channels and trying to make contact with other survivor groups. Most of what he heard was either automated emergency broadcasts or hostile groups coordinating raids on weaker positions. But occasionally, he picked up transmissions from organized survivor communities that were successfully defending territory and building sustainable operations. "There's a group about 50 miles north of here that's set up in an old mining facility," Jake reported during our morning briefing. "They're broadcasting on a low-power frequency, looking for people with specific skills: engineers, doctors, farmers, and craftsmen." That caught my attention. A community that valued practical skills over just military capability suggested people who were thinking long-term about rebuilding rather than just surviving day to day. It also suggested they had enough security to focus on construction and development rather than just defense. But 50 miles might as well have been 50,000 miles given the current state of the roads and the number of infected between here and there. We'd need reliable transportation, enough fuel for the journey, and a route that avoided the major population centers where infected concentrations would be highest. Maria was spending most of her time caring for Mrs. Henderson, but she was also planning for medical needs if we decided to attempt the journey north. Medications for treating injuries, antibiotics for preventing infection, and painkillers for dealing with the inevitable trauma of extended survival in hostile conditions. Around noon, Mrs. Henderson's condition took a dramatic turn for the worse. The fever broke, but instead of improving, she became agitated and aggressive, trying to bite anyone who came close to her. Her eyes had started to change, losing their human intelligence and taking on the flat, hungry look we'd seen in the infected. Maria called me over immediately. "This is it. She's entering the final stage. Once this process completes, she won't be Mrs. Henderson anymore." I thought about all the decisions I'd made over the past 3 days, all the times I'd chosen action over hesitation, practical solutions over emotional responses. This was the hardest choice yet, but it was also the most necessary. Mrs. Henderson had asked me to make this promise, and honoring her request was the last gift I could give her. I used my grandfather's wood chisel, the same tool that had ended her suffering at the gas station when she'd first been bitten. The tool that had built my career became the tool that gave her peace. My grandfather always said his chisels were for creating beautiful things, and in a way, giving someone dignity in death was the most beautiful thing you could create. The others understood what had happened without needing explanation. We buried Mrs. Henderson in the garden center, using plants and flowers to mark her grave. It seemed appropriate for someone who'd spent her retirement years creating beautiful spaces for people to enjoy. With Mrs. Henderson gone, our group dynamic changed significantly. We were down to 6 people, but we were also more mobile and less constrained by caring for someone who couldn't contribute to our defense. It was a terrible way to think about the loss of a good person, but survival mode forces you to calculate everything in terms of practical advantage. That afternoon, the raiders returned with reinforcements, twice as many vehicles, twice as many men, and better equipment including what looked like military-grade weapons and communication gear. They'd spent the night recruiting more fighters and gathering resources for a sustained assault on our position. Their leader approached under a white flag, wanting to negotiate rather than fight. He was a former military officer who'd organized his unit into a raiding party when government authority collapsed. His proposal was simple: surrender the Home Depot and join his group as subordinate members, or face an assault we couldn't possibly survive. I considered his offer carefully, applying the same analytical approach I used for complex construction projects. What were our resources? What were our alternatives? What were the likely outcomes of each possible choice? Joining his group meant giving up our autonomy and becoming part of an organization based on taking resources from weaker groups. We'd survive in the short term, but we'd lose the opportunity to build something better, something that reflected our values rather than just our need for security. Fighting meant almost certain death against overwhelming odds. 12 of us had barely held them off yesterday. 24 of them with better weapons would overrun our defenses within minutes. But there was a third option, one that required everything I'd learned about reading patterns and understanding systems. The raiders were focused on taking our supplies, but they weren't thinking about the long-term sustainability of their approach. Eventually, they'd run out of targets to raid, and their organization would collapse from internal conflicts over resource distribution. "Counter-proposal," I said to their leader. "We abandon this position and you take the supplies, but we offer our skills to help you build something more sustainable than a raiding operation." He was intrigued despite himself. Military officers are trained to think strategically, and he could see the limitations of his current approach as well as I could. "What kind of skills?" I explained our group's capabilities. "Construction knowledge, medical training, communications expertise, and experience with managing resources and defending territory. Skills that would be valuable for building a permanent base rather than just raiding temporary targets. We're not looking to join your group as subordinates," I continued. "We're proposing a partnership that benefits everyone. You provide security and leadership. We provide technical expertise and construction capabilities." The negotiation took 2 hours, but we reached an agreement that probably saved all our lives. The raiders would take the Home Depot supplies they needed, and we would accompany them to their base camp to evaluate the possibility of a longer-term alliance. If things worked out, we'd help them transition from raiding to sustainable community building. If not, we'd be free to leave and find our own way. It wasn't ideal, but it was realistic. In construction, you learn to work with imperfect materials and compromise solutions. The perfect project exists only in your imagination. Real projects require adapting to circumstances and making the best of available resources. The Raider Base Camp was located in an industrial district about 20 miles north of Phoenix, built around a concrete manufacturing facility that provided excellent defensive positions and access to construction materials. Their leader, who called himself Colonel Morrison, had done impressive work fortifying the position and organizing his followers into an effective military unit. But he'd also created the same problems that destroy most authoritarian organizations: internal competition for status, resentment over resource distribution, and growing tension between different factions within the group. Morrison was smart enough to recognize these problems, but he didn't have the management experience to solve them. That's where our skills became valuable. Dave's retail management experience translated directly into organizing supply distribution and work assignments. Linda's construction knowledge was essential for improving the base's infrastructure and defensive capabilities. Maria's medical training made her indispensable for treating injuries and maintaining group health. Jake's communication skills allowed him to establish contact with other survivor communities and coordinate information sharing rather than just raiding. Marcus provided energy and enthusiasm that helped bridge the gap between our group and Morrison's people. And my construction expertise became the foundation for transforming a raiding camp into a sustainable community. Over the following weeks, we helped Morrison's group transition from predatory raiding to productive community building. It wasn't easy, and there were conflicts and setbacks along the way. But gradually, we created something that could last, something that reflected our values of cooperation and mutual support rather than just survival of the strongest. The key insight was applying construction principles to community building. Just like building a cabinet, you start with a solid foundation, use quality materials, and design for long-term durability rather than short-term convenience. Every person in the community needed to feel like they had a valuable role and a stake in the collective success. We established trade relationships with other survivor communities rather than raiding them. We focused on producing goods and services that other groups needed: furniture, tools, medical supplies, and construction expertise. And we developed internal systems for education and skill sharing that ensured the community could continue growing and adapting over time. Looking back on those first 72 hours, I realized that everything I needed to survive the apocalypse was already part of my normal life. The analytical thinking I used for complex installations, the systematic approach I applied to project management, the attention to detail that had made me obsessive about over-engineering simple repairs. Most importantly, the understanding that good craftsmanship isn't just about creating individual objects. It's about building systems and relationships that can withstand stress and continue functioning when everything else breaks down. The same principles that made my grandfather's tools last for 3 generations also made our community strong enough to survive in a world where civilization had collapsed. They say the first 72 hours of any crisis are the most important. I survived them by remembering that good craftsmanship isn't just about creating something beautiful. It's about creating something that endures. And we built something that endures. We built something that gives people hope for the future, even when the present seems impossible. The outbreak changed everything about how we live, but it didn't change the fundamental truth my grandfather taught me. If you build something with care, using the right materials and proper techniques, it will last long enough to matter. Our community matters. The relationships we've built matter. And the skills we're passing on to the next generation will matter long after those first terrible 72 hours become just a memory. That's what survival really means. Not just staying alive from one day to the next, but building something worth preserving for the people who come after us. Something that honors the memory of people like Mrs. Henderson, who sacrificed everything to help others survive. Something that proves humanity can create beauty and meaning even in the darkest circumstances. We're still here. We're still building. And we're going to keep building until this broken world becomes something worth living in again.